Bill Anders, Apollo 8 astronaut and the person behind the famous Earthrise photograph, died last month, age 90.
So today, we're paying tribute to him by talking to our old friend Francis French, who spent a lot of time with him while researching his book, In the Shadow of the Moon.
If you have a good Bill Anders story, please let us know via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website, or by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform.
And please consider joining us on patreon.com/Space and Things. But right now, it's time for episode 201 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but it is right this time.
You're listening to the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 201 of our podcast. How are you doing, Emily?
I'm doing good. Started a new job, company confidential, but I'm doing pretty well. I'm in a good mood, so things are good. How you doing, Dave?
I'm not too bad, thanks. I'm not too bad at all. You have a Skylab podcast appearance thing coming up this week. Is it for charity?
Yes, I do. It's on. It's actually on Friday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central. So it's going to be me, David Hitt, John Molnix, and Dwight Stephen Bonecki.
Dream
We've had
team.
them all. Yes, we've had them all on our show. We're going to talk about Skylab's reentry. It is the 45th anniversary, which is wild. So we're going to do that Friday, and it will be a live show. So it'll be Friday morning, and like I said, 10 Eastern time, 9 Central. Hope to see y'all there.
That's tomorrow. If this podcast comes out on a Thursday, so you've only got today to think about it. If you've listened to this the day it comes out. So did I see that there's a charity element to this as well?
Yeah, we are taking up donations for Taking Up Space. We have some prizes as well, some actual nice Skylab prizes,
Amazing.
Skylab related. So if you love the program, you want to participate in this, it's going to be really cool.
Fantastic. Well, I will get information of that in the show notes, and we will put something out on our feed as well. But unfortunately, that's only for those who have listened on the first day. That's tomorrow. You haven't got much time, but keep an eye out for it. Anyway, let's get started. Very sad news last month when we learned that Bill Anders died at the age of 90. Anders was flying his vintage Beechcraft T-34 Mentor plane. And while we've not seen the official accident reports to know exactly what happened, Anders was performing some acrobatic maneuvers at the time of the crash.
Astronaut William Anders was among the esteemed members of NASA Astronaut Group 3, which also boasted names such as Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins, Dave Scott, and Alan Bean. Born in Hong Kong in 1933, Anders graduated from U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in 1955. Shortly after that, he was commissioned into the Air Force, setting his sights on becoming a pilot. He wanted to be a test pilot. At the recommendation of the Air Force's Aerospace Research Pilot Schools, or APRS, he earned an advanced degree in nuclear engineering to bolster his chances of being accepted to this more academically challenging school. Anders famously applied to ARPS. Around the same time, he applied to the NASA astronaut program, and as they say, the rest is history.
So as the late 1960s approached, Anders found himself assigned to what was then the third crewed Apollo mission, a significant milestone in his career. However, the path to the moon was challenging. The January 1967 Apollo 1 tragedy led to a redesign of the Apollo command module and a shift in the flight crews. A back injury and surgery sidelining Mike Collins further complicated the situation. Group 2 astronaut Jim Lovell would later replace Collins on Apollo 8. Yet by late 1968, Apollo managers, including George Low, put forward a bold proposal to have the second crewed Apollo flight circle the moon, a dramatic change from its original mission. Mission Commander Borman bravely agreed to this new plan. In December, the first Saturn V carrying humans rocketed into space from Kennedy Space Center en route to lunar orbit.
It's often been said that during Apollo 8, humanity didn't just discover the moon. We also discovered Earth. Anders, in a moment that would forever change our perspective, took the iconic Earthrise photo of our planet peeking just over the moon's limb, a celestial multicolored oasis amid velvety blackness. This image, a testament to the beauty and fragility of our home, has since become a symbol of our shared humanity. Anders said in a NASA JSC oral history regarding this famous image,
"That one view is sunk in my head. Then there's another one I like maybe, and this is of the first full Earth picture that made it again look very colourful. To me, the significance of this is that the moon is about the size of your fist, held at arm's length. You can imagine that at 100 arm's length, the Earth is down to the size of a dust mote, and 100 lunar distances in space are really nothing. You haven't gone anywhere, not even to the next planet. So here was this orb looking like a Christmas tree ornament, very fragile, not an infinite expanse of granite, and seemingly of a physical insignificance, and yet it was our home.
More humorously, Anders added that the crew's commander Borman was studiously more concerned with their sleep. In retrospect, I wish I would have taken more pictures, but Frank was more concerned about whether we were rested or not, so he forced Lovell and I to go to sleep, which probably made sense. Following his return from Apollo 8, Anders showcased his versatility and adaptability. He was assigned as Apollo 11's backup lunar module pilot. In late 1969, Anders became the executive secretary of the National Aeronautics and Space Council, and later in the 1970s was appointed to the Atomic Energy Commission by President Nixon and as ambassador to Norway during the Carter administration. These governmental appointments were just the beginning of his diverse aerospace and engineering career. Anders then transitioned into private industry and worked for General Electric, Textron, and General Dynamics until his retirement. Even in retirement, he continued to make a difference and founded the Heritage Flight Museum, which operates near Burlington, Washington. Anders was married to the former Valerie Elizabeth Horde, with whom he had 6 children.
And today we're joined by our friend Francis French, who we've had on this podcast a number of times, often, unfortunately, when one of our heroes has died. In the course of Francis writing his books, he has had audience with and spent a lot of time with a number of our favourite Apollo astronauts. So he has an insight that very few others do. His book, In the Shadow of the Moon, which he co-wrote with Colin Burgess, has a whole chapter on Anders and the time he spent with him. So let's talk to Francis to find out more about Bill Anders.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, isn't that pretty? Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick. Take several. Take several up here. Wait a minute, let's get the right setting here. Calm down, Bubble. Oh, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot.
Okay, welcome, Francis. Tell us about how you first came into contact with Bill Anders, and what was that like?
Well, moving to San Diego from England, I was amazed how many of those original astronauts were virtual neighbors. You know the feeling when you live in London and that area. Astronauts come to a big special event in 1s or 2s every couple of years, and it's a big deal. So when you suddenly realize that I can literally look out my window from here and see the hill on which he lives, the family has a house over there. And I'm thinking, that's an almost neighbor who was the first person jointly to go to the moon. That was an amazing feeling. And then one of the original Mercury astronauts, Wally Schirra, lived not far away. So as I was writing my magazine articles and about to embark on my first book, I was incredibly gratified by how nice Bill and his family were. They invited me over a number of times. You go to a house where there's a wood engraving on the floor of the Apollo 8 patch logo with the orbit around the moon and the Earth. And just you realize that you're sitting down with history, and just to be able to, all those things that you sort of build up over the years of just wanting to sit down with somebody and say, what was it like to go to the moon? It in all its various incarnations, all came true. So incredibly gracious guy, incredibly gracious family, and that continued for many decades.
So he was someone who was intensely proud of the mission then, and what he achieved.
Oh, absolutely. I think Bill was quite an enigma to people who didn't know him, because he came across a little bit like Alan Shepard. His initial appearance was quite gruff. Now, I only met Alan Shepard once, but the accounts I heard from others would sort of say, yeah, they were similar in that he was quite intimidating at first, and some people would kind of like run and hide. But you realized if you just sort of looked him in the eye and perhaps sort of stood up a little bit to him and what he was trying to say, he was kind of a bit of a test. And once she realized there was a kind of a twinkle in the eye and a wry kind of smile behind that gruffness, she realized, okay, he's pushing me to see whether I'm going to push back. And once you did that, all was good. And yes, absolutely, he only flew in space once, but what a mission to be the first mission to the moon. And he was intensely proud of that. Absolutely. Well, he had one of the most successful, if not the most successful post-astronaut career, went on to run some major aerospace companies and do incredibly well out of that and continue to fly the rest of his life. He had a wonderful post-astronaut career. He did always like looking back on it and was certainly very proud of what he did.
So upon rereading your chapter about him in The Shadow of the Moon, which I'm a little biased, it's a fine book, one of my favorites, Anders was not a test pilot. That's not to say he didn't have great piloting skills, but he was one of among the first astronauts who was not a test pilot, him, Schweikert, and Cunningham. Can you elaborate a bit on that and what his presence kind of brought to NASA at the time? That's a big difference from the first two, I would say at least the second astronaut class, I think was all test pilots.
Absolutely. Thanks for those kind words about In the Shadow of the Moon. That was the first book chapter, the one about Anders, I wrote with an astronaut interview as part of it. I wrote other chapters about people who'd passed away, but that one I remain sort of like, that was my first go. So it's lovely to reread again for this purpose. Bill kind of tried to work the politics of setting himself up to become an astronaut in some ways, but certainly in advancing his Air Force piloting career. And he got it wrong, not for any fault of his own, but because of the timing. He was a very skilled pilot. He wanted to apply to test pilot school, and they said, well, what we need is academic background. So he went off to get an advanced degree. He ended up getting pushed into nuclear shielding, radiation shielding, something which I know you have some familiarity with from your Navy career. And it's something that wasn't even his first choice, but it was where his career went. He got the master's degree that he was told would be really helpful to get into test pilot school. So then he reapplied, but by then Chuck Yeager, the legendary guy who was the first pilot to break the sound barrier, he was in charge of the test pilot school. And Yeager was famously dismissive of people with essentially better education than he had. He's like, it's all about stick and rudder. It's all about being a good pilot. So you should have been building up your flying time. So Bill did what he was told to get into the school. By the time he reapplied, the school's rules had changed. And so he didn't get into test pilot school. It did, however, give him exactly what NASA was looking for around 63 when they wanted a new group, the third group, because as you mentioned, people before were very good test pilots, but NASA realized they're going to need some people with more scientific backgrounds. So they looked at people like Bill Anders and Walt Cunningham and Rusty Schweikert, as you mentioned. Alan Bean further down the line sort of got lumped into that group as well, of people who they were very impressive pilots, yet they also had expertise in areas that NASA knew was going to be very important to go to the moon. It turned out that Bill, with his radiation shielding, was somebody who, when they're looking at the Apollo spacecraft, leaving the Earth's magnetic field, going through the Van Allen radiation belts out to the moon for the very first time, what better guy to be working on the spacecraft than the guy whose life is going to depend on whatever solutions they have to any radiation issues as they leave Earth orbit. So, yeah, it was one of those things where a turn in his career that he didn't want actually turned into an advantage for him and for NASA. The trouble is, of course, that Deke Slayton, the head of the astronaut office, was also kind of like Yeager, though in a different way, quite dismissive of people who didn't have a test pilot career. I personally believe he was incorrect. I think there was a lot of amazing pilots that could have done a lot more, but weren't part of what Deke considered his brethren. But I wasn't in his shoes at the time when, if somebody had made a mistake and the mission had gone wrong because of a piloting error, all fingers would have pointed to that. So I understand the politics of the time and the mindset of the time, even though I think they did marginalize some incredibly good people as a result. So Bill he was selected, and then he realized he and those other big folks you mentioned were going to kind of be bottom of the pile when it came to who was going to get selected for missions first. He did some amazing work on Gemini, backup crew, Capcom during one of the most difficult times when Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott almost died. He was Capcom for some of that, but he didn't get to fly. And so he kind of got pushed into early Apollo, which turned out to be pretty good for him.
So we know he flew on the crew as a lunar module pilot, but there was no lunar module for Apollo 8. But one thing that In the Shadow of the Moon mentions quite a bit is that he was very systems experienced. He had actually a lot of command module experience and things like that. He probably had more than Lovell at the time. So can you elaborate a bit on that and what he brought to Apollo 8, since I honestly feel his role in Apollo 8 is kind of underrated because he was the LMP for a mission that had no lunar module.
Yeah, Bill was one of the most experienced people on the lunar module, and he was crestfallen when they canceled a mission where he was not going to be flying one. I mean, it turned out to be for a good reason. America decided to beat the Russians to the moon. They're going to not have a lunar module on Apollo 8. They're going to fly around the moon, do some lunar orbits, and get back. It was a very audacious, brave, very risky, and some at the time thought foolhardy decision. It paid off. Had anything gone wrong, we might have been talking about it very differently. But at the time, it was audacious and brave and success. It did mean, however, that he was a incredibly skilled lunar module guy who didn't get to fly the spacecraft he was expert in initially. He flew that lunar training simulator, the one that Neil Armstrong crashed. He loved saying how Neil crashed it. He didn't. He would always joke about that. But he knew that system inside out. Once he realized that they were not going to fly it, he became an expert on the command module, not just more than Jim Lovell. He actually would say he knew it more than Frank Borman. In fact, Frank would kind of get a little bit annoyed that this guy who's supposed to be the number 3 on the crew actually knew more than the commander. Those guys were such a tightly bonded crew that they would rag each other about stuff like that for the rest of their lives, which was kind of fun to watch the 3 of them go back and forward. But there was a grain of truth to a lot of that ribbing. And, Frank was very fixed on the mission operations and on the mission objectives, being a good commander. And it allowed Bill to find a place to really know the systems of that spacecraft. Jim Lovell came in kind of late, as many of us know. Mike Collins was going to be on that crew. Even he was a replacement. Charlie Bassett, I believe, was going to be on there first, as I recall. But then Mike Collins came in, but then had a medical issue. He had to come off. Jim Lovell came in relatively late. Of course, he'd flown with Frank Borman before at Gemini, so they knew each other. But there's no discredit to Jim Lovell. He just didn't know the spacecraft as well because he was brought in kind of last minute. In many ways, they kind of had him stay out the way for a lot of it while Frank concentrated on commanding. And so Bill ended up flying the spacecraft kind of as a command module pilot in many ways, which he realized was going to set back his hopes of landing on the moon. Anybody who was a lunar module pilot expert generally got to land on the moon somewhere down the line. And as he saw, he was becoming a command module expert, which in many ways is a more prestigious place to be. But he realized, it doesn't look like I'm going to land on the moon. I'll fly back to the moon as a command module pilot, and I'll back up. And by the time I rotate to being a commander, it's going to be Apollo 19. It's going to be Apollo 20. He didn't think the missions were going to last that long. So he already realized, I'm an expert in something I'm never going to do. But it was because he was so good at what he was able to pick up 2 different spacecraft in a very short period of time. One
of the big reveals in that chapter is that the crew almost could have been Apollo 11 from what I remember. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I find it really awesome that Anders didn't really have anything towards Borman because of that. Like, he didn't have any resentment that he didn't end up landing on the moon or anything like that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. We kind of go back to Deke Slayton again and how he looked at these crews, and he kind of seemed to believe that Frank Borman could fly and command everything and anything, which is a great testament to Frank. When Apollo 8 got back, Deke Slayton apparently was thinking, let's just rotate them right round and have them make the first moon landing. How serious that was, how far it would have got through upper management is hard to say, but it made sense. This was a crew that did an incredible job and got back and forth from the moon. But, Frank was getting kind of burned out at that point. His wife was not doing very well, as we know. He got sick on that mission for what we now think might have been space sickness, which has affected many other space crew ever since, but this was one of the first American documented incidences of it. So he was thinking, I'm ready to move on to something else. And so apparently, without asking Jim Lovell or Bill Anders, he was offered tentatively, but quite seriously, the opportunity to become the Neil Armstrong to make the first moon landing attempt, and said, no, I'm good. And Bill, of course, later in life would joke about that and go, oh, you could have asked me first. I would have probably said, yes, I will be on the first moon landing. And again, it's hard to know. Bill would say decades later, I understand it was not a big deal. We all went on to do other things. Whether he felt that way that day, who knows? That's the good and the bad thing about us interviewing people decades later is they've had time to settle the story in their mind. But probably if you'd asked him that day, by the way, Frank just turned down the opportunity for you all to land on the moon, he might have been a little less philosophical about it, maybe. Who knows?
That's funny.
I want to bring up the thing that perhaps he is most famous for, which is the Earthrise photo. Did he ever consider himself to be a master of photography, or was it just a bit of potluck that he was the one who took that photo?
It was incredible luck, not just for the crew, for him, but for humanity that photo got taken. And I think it goes to the fact that as explorers, we don't know what we're going to find till we get there. The wonderful thing about exploration is we go there with one objective in mind, and then we find out something completely unexpected and new. We're finding that on Mars all the time, every time a rover goes around a corner. And this was the wonderful thing about that mission is they went to look at the moon. They went to study the moon up close. So the very first time human eyes are looking directly on the far side of the moon, they're looking at the lunar surface up close. Makes total sense. They're going to explore the moon. You think that's going to be the objective. And yet the thing that has profoundly changed how we think about our own planet, profoundly changed how we think about the environment, how we think about humanity and our role in the cosmos, is a picture taken of Earth, not of the moon. Mm-hmm. And it's that very first time they're coming around the leading edge of the moon, and they see that Earth rising above this barren, gray, stark surface that looks completely devoid of life. And you see this tiny blue jewel rising in the horizon with all the color, all the life, all the warmth of everything we know. In retrospect, it seems obvious that's going to be very moving. There had been robot probes that had taken black and white images that we got an idea of what the scale of the picture was going to be. But until human eyes saw that and had a good color camera at hand to take that shot, it never occurred to us that we're going to relearn our own planet by going 250,000 miles away. So that is incredible. There was a lot of confusion and conjecture about who took that picture for many years. Frank Borman was convinced he did. Because there were a number of cameras lying around and there were a number of films they could go back and forward. For a while, it looked like Frank had taken the first picture, which is a black and white one of the Earth just about to rise, and then Bill had taken the color one. Turns out Bill took both of those. And so for years, Bill and Frank would go back and forward about joking about who took it. And of course, Jim Lovell, being the jokester he is, said, no, it was me, I took it, even though he knew it wasn't him. So just so they could all joke about it. But it turns out Andy Chaikin did a lot of really good work to absolutely nail who did it, and listening to the transcripts, and turns out Bill definitely took those pictures. But it was one of those moments completely unexpected, completely unplanned, completely unscheduled. In fact, if you listen to the audio of the crew talking to each other, you could hear Bill being, for quite a gruff, stern, serious, focused guy, you suddenly hear that moment where he breaks through and he's like, oh my goodness, look at that. And Frank Borman, being the gruff commander, was like, well, don't take that. That's not scheduled. It's not a mission thing. And then he sees it and goes, wow, where's the camera? So they all have this moment where they've gone from being very, very serious about what they're doing. They're the first humans to get into lunar orbit. Frank Borman's very concerned about that engine on the back. The one single engine has to fire to get them out of lunar orbit. Otherwise, they would still be there. They wouldn't get home. Some very serious stuff to consider. But for a moment, they also have that childlike wonder of, oh my goodness, that's our home planet coming over the horizon. And that photo and another photo from Apollo 17 essentially get credited for kickstarting the environmental movement of the early 1970s. We've learned how to protect and take care of our planet. We think about it very differently, apparently, from that moment forward. Instead of this enormous place that we can just dump chemicals into the ocean, dump pollutants into the sky, and we're on this enormous planet, nobody's going to notice, it's fine. We suddenly realize we're on this tiny, tiny little oasis in the vastness and darkness of space that is very fragile. The atmosphere of our planet is really thin. The resources are clearly finite. And when you can put your thumb up and make the whole Earth and everybody you know and everybody you love disappear, it becomes profound. It becomes a human, visceral experience. So Bill spent the rest of his life talking about that. He was very proud of that photo. It became a stamp. It's been used on everything. You'd think he'd get a bit fed up with talking about it, but no, he was very proud of that moment. It's very interesting that the contrast of that is he would look at the moon and he found the moon very barren, boring. He said, well, there's nothing there. It's just a dead place. So for the first person to go to the moon and be profoundly uninterested in the moon personally was quite revelatory to him and to others. The fact that really we learned about the Earth by going as far away as the moon.
Absolutely. I think out of a lot of the Apollo astronauts of that time, I think Anders had probably the most diverse slate of experiences after he left NASA. I know he worked for the Nixon administration in some capacity. He worked for the Atomic Energy Commission. He was the ambassador to Norway under the Carter administration. He worked in private enterprise. He established an aviation museum also in Washington State, where he ended up retiring for a while. To me, that's almost unexpected, because if you look at, Bill Anders' resume, you think, oh, he's just this fighter pilot jock kind of guy. How do you think he had such a diverse post-NASA career in opposition to some of his colleagues?
Well, he was very, very smart, and he was very, very lucky, I think. If you look at who got out of first or who stayed in meaningfully after their Apollo missions, you realize there were only a couple of years where you went from being a really hot commodity to being just another Apollo astronaut. Look at Mike Collins. He immediately realized he could have stayed around and commanded Apollo 17, but if he got out at that moment, he could go and work for the White House, and then he could go on to become the head of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And basically, President Nixon looked at the Apollo 11 crew and literally said to them, anything you want, it's yours, just name the job. I mean, Buzz Aldrin remembers that moment and going, it sounds kind of absurd. It's like the leader of the free world is saying, whatever you want. But a couple of years down the line, people coming off Apollo 15, 16, 17, no such offers were being made. In fact, it was like, you guys still here? What are you doing? And it was hard to find jobs for some of them, or find out what to do next with their lives after their Apollo missions. Frank Borman was very smart too. He realized after 8 that he wasn't going to stick around, and he went and worked for President Nixon right away, was his advisor for Apollo 11, which was very, very helpful for that mission. And Bill Anders followed his lead and did very well working for the White House, and then went into private industry. And he probably did better than anybody else, certainly did better financially than anybody else. Like I mentioned, he could be quite a gruff, serious character who you didn't cross. And I got some stories to tell you about that too, because often there was a harder goal behind that. And some of the things he did privately behind the scenes for folks were wonderful. But he had no problem about going into a company and saying, we need to shut down this entire section, and we need to lay off all these people, things which he didn't make many friends in some towns because of that. But nevertheless, the time of retraction and slowing down of the aerospace industry, somebody was going to be the hatchet guy. So he was the hatchet guy for some places. He also, but streamlining companies, downsizing companies was something that was going to happen at that time. So he did very well by being the guy who made the tough decisions in industry. And as a result, had financially the most successful post-Apollo career of any of those guys. The other guys envied him. And as you mentioned, started his own museum. Heritage Flight Museum up in Bellingham, Washington, is a wonderful place. I highly encourage anybody who's heading north of Seattle, just up by the Canadian border, to stop by there. Particularly right now, they're doing some lovely memorials to Bill. It's also just an incredible collection of airplanes. You realize that's where his heart was, just as folks like Neil Armstrong love to fly, canvas and wood aircraft rather than the high-tech spacecraft. The same with Bill. You had these World War II era fighter jets that he was in a financial position to, I want to fly this plane, so I'm going to start my own museum and fly them as much as I want. And that's where his heart was. Most of the time, one of the things I remember about having lunch with him, he always smelled of engine oil because he was always out tinkering with something. And when you saw World War II era fighter planes in museums, I had the fortunate opportunity to walk through other museums with him. Most of his gruff comments were like, that plane could still fly. It should not be in the museum right now. I could take that right out. I could put some oil in it, and away I go. He did not like seeing airplanes static. As far as he was concerned, they should all still be flying. But while he was gruff, and while he, like Tom Stafford, he could pick up a phone and make things change, he would sometimes use that hammer for very heartfelt reasons that they're private ones, so I can't share on this forum, but things such as there was a museum that did a display that was somewhat disparaging to some of his Apollo colleagues. They told a story that he thought shouldn't be told. He had the power to go in and say, let's change this. But he also had the financial ability to go and say, not only do I want this changed, but because I respect my colleagues so much, I'm going to pay for this change. I want you to change this exhibition. It's up to you whether you do or you don't. If you ever want to see me again here, you're going to change it. And I'm going to pay for the change.
Wow.
And he just paid for an entire museum display to be changed just because he didn't like what he said about his colleagues. And so that's the kind of guy he was. He wanted his way, but he also put literally his money where his mouth was. And he was willing to quietly sponsor things behind the scenes.
Alrighty. So other than that story, and obviously you don't have to tell us the particulars of it, do you have any other favorite stories or memories of Bill Anders? I know in the Shadow of the Moon, there's this wonderful portrait that you took of him, and I really think that captures his essence. It's a beautiful not a painting, but it's a beautiful photograph.
I have so many great memories of hanging out with him. There's such a tightly bonded family. This is a guy who he met his wife Valerie when they were in high school, and they kind of lost their connection and reconnected. They live just a couple of miles from where I live right now, around the corner. There's a high school over there where 3 astronauts went to that high school. Most high schools don't have one, but high schools around the country say, we have an astronaut who graduated from our school. But this high school around the corner from me can say, oh, that's cute. We had 3. The first guy to go to the moon, the first Latina in space, and a shuttle commander. What have you got? He was with his wife, Valerie, his entire life. They were so bonded. And his family were such a lovely group of kids, but his family, some of his kids were sometimes, they would almost use me. They'd be like, you tell dad that, because if we tell him, he's going to get mad at us. So you tell him that the thing he just said is a little bit off, and tell him the story. So it was funny to be in the middle of some of these conversations where you realize he could be sometimes quite an intimidating father figure, but just heart-meltingly lovely. The thing that used to really annoy all the autograph collectors, and I know there are some that are listening, that there was a fellow astronaut of Bill's who started selling off some of his collection, and Bill had taken stuff to the moon to give to his fellow astronauts. And when some people became the first people to put stuff in auction houses, Bill was like, well, I'm not going to give things and do stuff just so somebody else can sell it. So he just stopped signing autographs unless it was somebody he knew well. But he kind of enjoyed being gruff like that. But if you knew him, then you'd be talking to something and he'd look across the table, he'd look at a book we were referencing, he'd be like, you want me to sign that for you? So he would just offer. And, so that the teenage kid in me that remembers writing to him without any luck for an autograph kind of went like, he's offering to sign all my books just because I'm sitting here with it. Yeah, sign them all. So it was very interesting how there was this inner and outer kind of side with him where he quite fearsome and really want his way. But if he trusted you, if he knew you, then all of a sudden those doors came down and he would do anything for somebody who he believed he should have their back. He would see what he considered injustices and slights, and he'd be like, I'm going to make a phone call. And woe betide the person on the other end of the line, because he would not stop until he got his way. I am so glad I was on his side and he was on mine, because good grief, it would have been a very difficult book to write if I got something wrong, that's for sure. Lovely guy. He's going to be very, very missed, because we now can't turn to the guy who took that incredible photo and say, describe that to us. It's a shame. Really, he's going to be very missed.
Absolutely. Anders was probably one of the more low-key Apollo astronauts, especially in the later years. He didn't go to a lot of the events. I think I've only seen him once, but I never talked to him because I was like, he's just chilling, drinking his wine. I'm not going to bug him. He was kind of a more private astronaut in his later years. And I think because of that, people don't have as many they know him from Earthrise, but they don't really know him, what he was like. So what do you think his legacy ultimately is, other than that, maybe that great photo he took?
Yeah, Bill wasn't so much private as a little bit like Neil Armstrong, is that he put his focus where he wanted it to be. If you went to the big air conventions around the country, Oshkosh and those, he's almost always going to be there, but he's not the Apollo astronaut walking into the room. He's a little old guy in a flight suit, you covered in oil, who's, hey, I'm taking you on my airplane. You want to talk with me? Come sit next to me while I'm adjusting this part of an engine or something. He loved flying. And so the Apollo thing was just one part of a very rich aviation life. So if you knew where to find him, he was out there all the time. He just wasn't, as you mentioned, at space events as much. But he would rock up for things that I was very surprised. At the Air and Space Museum in San Diego, there's a Wright Flyer engine replica, which if you ever stood next to that, it sounds like a lawnmower right next to your ear. It's a very loud thing, but very good to get the general public understanding what that very first powered flight was like. He would just show up for that when it was being once a year on the anniversary of the Wright brothers. They'd power it up, and all of a sudden you look over, you're like, oh, there's Bill Anders, just because this is aviation, there he is. So low key, as you mentioned, but kind of a constant presence around. The legacy is going to be the Earthrise picture, I think, because it profoundly changed how humanity see our planet. But I think there's more to it. As you mentioned, there's other legacies too. And one of them is that Apollo 11 justifiably gets so much attention, so much hype, because it was the first moon landing. We walked on the moon. I mean, it's hard to get bigger than that. But it wasn't the first time humans went to the moon. Apollo 8 gets overlooked. And there is that moment where humanity breaks the boundaries of Earth. You know, Mike Collins, who was going to be on that mission, is in mission control, and he says, go for TLI, go for translunar insertion or translunar injection. I forget which one it is. And he realizes in that moment, this is a profound moment. Humans are leaving Earth orbit, leaving our cradle of humanity for the very first time. And I should be saying something profound. I should be like, go, my star voyagers, voyage forward. And instead he goes, go for TLI. And he's thinking, this is such a banal statement for such a profound moment. And I think that might be part of Bill's legacy, which is, you know, he's on that very first crew, and in many ways is the most important person in terms of what came back, that we left our planet. We went somewhere else, and we look back on our planet. So you can't take that away from him. You know, no matter what happens next, and I'm looking forward to humans going back to the moon, and that's going to be profoundly different, and we're going to learn new things we're not expecting again, but nobody else can be first. And even Apollo 11 wasn't first. Apollo 8 was first, and Bill was a vital part of Apollo 8.
Yep. You've mentioned a few times that aviation was really his big passion. He did perhaps shy away from space events, but how much did he keep in touch with what was going on in the space industry, aerospace industry? There was an interview, I recall, I think it was around the 50th anniversary of either Apollo 8 or Apollo 11, where on the BBC he did an interview where it was a big statement. Bill Anders, first person to one of the first people to go to the moon, has said, we shouldn't go back. Was he actively involved? Did he have good relationships with people at NASA, other astronauts? How was he involved in the actual space industry / astronaut community? Or did he step away from it?
I think most of those Apollo astronauts get to a point where they either stay in the mix or they sort of bow out. And Bill was definitely far more focused on his aviation stuff than staying completely current in the space world. However, this is a very opinionated guy, and he's always going to have an opinion. And when it came to being interviewed, he always had a very interesting point of view. So he was staying current, to my knowledge. Certainly, anytime I asked him about what was going on, he seemed to be very understanding of what the current plans were, but he almost always had a very strong opinion about it. The thing that I found most fascinating when people were asking him about the space program and current plans is he really did want to bypass the moon and go onto Mars with human crewed spacecraft. And the thing that I remember sticking with me at the time was he said, I'll go. I'm old. I'll probably get cancer from the radiation, but who cares? I'm old. I'll die out there. That's the whole point of going somewhere, is you don't have to come back. I'm sure his wife, Valerie, wasn't too pleased when he said that publicly, but nevertheless, I got his point, and it really made me think there's something to be said for sending people who are older, who don't necessarily care what happens to them medically. If they're still physically capable of doing things on space missions, maybe that's a very good point. And if they're offering, why not? So I kind of loved the thought that Bill Anders, having been jointly the first person to go to the moon, may have ended up being the first person to go to Mars if they just accepted his offer and got the spacecraft built in time, you know. So every now and then he'd say something like that might not have been talking about the cutting edge operational side of the current human spaceflight plans, but in many ways was more important because it was a observation based on years and decades and a whole lifetime of being in that world that was like, there's a thought nobody else has expressed.
And one final one from me. Obviously, you just mentioned there that he said he was happy to go somewhere to fly to Mars and pass away. He died flying. Is that something that you think is quite poetic in the case of Bill Anders? Or, I mean, obviously it's a tragedy, but 90-year-olds dying flying, there's something quite poetic about someone who loved aviation, in my mind. Do you think he would have seen it that way? I
don't know, in that right now it's very early to say what happened to that plane. And of course, accident investigations and other reports have to come out. So my thinking on this could profoundly change based on what investigators say. But I think most of us felt some kind of comfort. Certainly the people I spoke to on that day or who called me on that day kind of expressed what you said, which is, hey, he went out doing something he loved doing. He was in an airplane on his own, so nobody else was involved. He hit the water, so nobody else on the ground got injured or anything like that. Given all the tragedy it was and is, it could have been worse. And yes, he was doing something he was pursuing his entire life. And there are certainly worse ways for somebody dedicated to his whole life of flying to go. Now that's, as I mentioned, my thought this week, and something could come out that could profoundly change that. But you do have to take some kind of comfort in that's what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. And that is what he was doing right up to the final moments of his life.
Well, thank you once again for joining us, said on another sad occasion. Your insights are always wonderful. And for those people who haven't read your books, buy them all. Yeah. Buy them all.
Buy them now.
In the Shadow of the Moon, I've read this one about 4 times. I always forget how many insights there are in it. I know you co-wrote this one with Colin, but that Anders chapter in particular is really insightful into what enabled him to get there, and what kind of person he was. And ultimately, he was very different from a lot of the other people that were involved at that point, and you capture that really well. So thanks for joining us today, but also thank you for writing that and enabling us to learn more about Bill, as you have done over the years. For people that were never going to be able to do that, reading your account of what he was like is absolutely fascinating. So thank you.
Where things meet space. This is Space and Things.
All right, well, it's always lovely to speak to Francis once again for sad reasons. As we've mentioned, he just has such great insight. I want to share something. I'm sitting with a copy of In the Shadow of the Moon next to me because I reread the chapter that's about Bill before we had the interview, and on the dust jacket, whatever you call them, the bit of paper that surrounds the hardback, there is a quote here. It says, "My husband told the authors stories about his Apollo 8 mission that he had never even told me." And that's a quote from Valerie Anders.
That's great.
Who was Bill's wife. And I think Francis seems to have got a way of making the subjects he interviews talk and tell great stories. And we get to experience them secondhand through him. And that's a trait which should not be overlooked. Francis is a wonderful person and he's a great historian, but also these people respected Francis. And although right now we want to be talking about Bill, I think we have to just give some praise to Francis because there's a reason we always want to call him. When we've had other tribute episodes, Emily and I have said, should we ask Francis? And then we realised we always ask Francis. We should look for someone else. Yeah. And it's not that other people haven't been great, but we know that Francis is always going to have amazing insight into these people that he's interviewed. We don't want to just call him up every time someone dies. It feels like that's such a tragic thing.
I'm a little biased. I love all of Francis's books. I love In the Shadow of the Moon. I really love that chapter because Anders was not really somebody I knew a lot about because, like we said in the interview portion, he was kind of low-key, I don't know private, but sort of a low-key guy, I feel like that chapter that Francis wrote, I feel like it just enabled us to know Bill Anders. Francis is the right person to talk to, unfortunately, on such a sad occasion because he really just nailed it with that magnificent book.
You should also check out, if you haven't read it already, A Man on the Moon by Andy Chaikin. It also has a lot of Bill Anders in that. So he was interviewed heavily for that as well. So he's someone that when interviewed by someone he respected, gave a lot of gold. And that's great. And I think also what's great about both of those stories, both of those books and the way they tell the Apollo 8 story is they do it from Anders' perspective. It'd be so easy to do it from Borman or Lovell because they're perhaps better known.
Yeah.
But to do it from the person that perhaps is the enigmatic one of the three, and it's not enigmatic, but it's just slightly more low-key.
The least known the least known.
Exactly. I think adds a different depth to the Apollo 8 story. The Apollo 8 story, I mean, Apollo 8 is my favorite mission. I always say that. And this year we've lost both Frank and Bill. The history of that flight and what it represents and how important it was, we are, as we always say, getting to that horrible time when we have to start saying goodbye to the people involved in that history. And that's so sad. It's so sad.
It sucks. I hate it. I hate every minute of it. I hate losing these guys. The space community has been very friendly with a lot of them, and a lot of them have been wonderful to us, but it sucks losing that history. It just sucks. That's all. It just sucks. I forgot who I was talking to. It may have been Lois in Space Hipsters, but it's like almost like the occupational hazard you deal with for falling in love with guys who are in their 80s and 90s. You know?
Exactly. Right.
It really is. It just stinks. And health permitting, I hope we hang on to the ones who are left as long as possible, because it's just, these people are just living legends, and that's all I got to say.
Absolutely. Well, Bill, we're going to miss you.
Yes.
When we spoke to Jennifer Lavasseur at the Smithsonian, she was telling us some great Bill Anders stories about the cameras, and when they found the Earthrise camera, and he was really involved in making sure that it was the right one. He wanted people to know that story. And do you know what my favorite part of that interview with Francis just was? For me personally, was hearing that when you went to his house, he had the Apollo 8 emblem logo patch embossed into the floor. I love that. I love that. That was so cool. It's like, yes,
that's sweet.
I want those guys to be proud of what they did, because I think some of them, it was just one part of their life, and perhaps that was all they were ever asked about. So perhaps they didn't express the joy of what they did as much. But knowing that he put that on in such a great place in his house, I just love that. I think that's such a great story.
He put it in a place of pride, because it was something for him to be proud of. I mean, that is a magnificent contribution. Even if all they did was get that damn picture, they did a lot more than that.
Oh, yeah.
Even if all they did was get that photo, it would have been worth it, in my opinion.
Absolutely. All right. So for those of you who are on our Patreon page, you can watch the full interview with Francis. Just head over there. And if you want to know more about Francis or his books or in his work, look in the show notes, which you can find on spaceandthingspodcast.com, or by clicking on the link in the description of this podcast on your podcast provider.
From Gagarin to Shatner, this is the Space and Things podcast.
So, Emily, what has caught your eye in spaceflight this last week?
There has been a lot of news in the last few weeks since we've been sort of away from the show about Starliner, and a lot of headlines about it being stuck in space and the crew stranded, yada, yada. NASA has stated the crew is not stranded in any way, so they're not in any immediate danger or anything like that. But Starliner does not have a return date yet, just because the ground wants to test the spacecraft in light of some of the helium leaks that were from the spacecraft. As we know about, when it went to the ISS, it had some helium leaks reported. So again, Starliner is not stranded, but they are testing it. So its return is indefinitely delayed. But as soon as we get a return date, we will share it with y'all, so everybody will be in the loop about that. So just an update to that story. That's probably one of the big stories in spaceflight this week, and probably the last few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has anything caught your eye this week, Dave?
Yeah, there's this one wild story, Emily, which I don't know if you've seen the video. A private Chinese rocket accidentally launches during test. So it's a company called Space Pioneer and their new Tianlong 3 rocket, which was supposed to stay on the ground during a test. This was on June the 30th, and it took off. And obviously, that is not good news at all. I'll post a link to the story, as always, but you've got to check out the video. So they briefly ignited the engines, which is standard protocol. This happens for every rocket. You hear this all the time, static fires. You know, that the rocket is anchored to the launch pad, and they just check the engines. But the anchoring mechanism failed. So that is not good news at all. So that's the dramatic story that's caught my eye this week. And if you want to know more with anything we talk about, check the show notes. You can find them by clicking in the link that's in the description of this podcast on your podcast provider, or by heading to spaceandthingspodcast.com.
Please leave a review on your podcast platform. We love hearing your thoughts.
So that's all, folks. Thanks for joining us this week. We would really love to hear your Bill Anders story, so please do get in touch via our social media pages or on the contact form on our website. Thanks as always to our Patreon subscribers. For those who aren't members, you can head over to patreon.com/spaceandthings to find out what all the fuss is about.
Yes, and also thank you for all the kind words that we've seen in lieu of our 200th episode on our socials, on Space Hipsters, etc. We really appreciate it. It's been really cool to see. So thank you for listening. We'll be back next week for more Space and Things, but don't forget, in space, no one can hear you mean.
Thanks for listening to the Space and Things podcast. Back next week with a whole lot more.